I agree. I think that, starting it off with that little exercise was a really good, at least for me, an affirmation of what we are definitely hearing in our conversations with businesses around the state. A lot of the functions that are causing some of that volatility are slightly beyond our ability to directly influence. So, in a lot of ways, what my department does and what we have done now a number of times, including global pandemics, including previous volatile economic times, has been to do what we can to sort of tamp down that volatility. And that's a big part of what we do. And we are engaged in that fairly heavily at the moment. As you might imagine, all of the news and attention right now is on what's happening with the tariffs and with Canada and Mexico and China. Um, our goal, at least at this point, has been to continue to really maintain what have been historically strong relationships with our Canadian federal partners as well as provincial partners. The governor and I have been meeting with those officials right from the start when she came on board early in January to maintain those relationships. And I think we've really made it clear, and I know the governor has spoken to this effect, that her first priority, as mine, is the New Hampshire economy, and that we have made those thoughts known to our federal partners in Washington. We stand by and watch as the federal entities of both our nations try to work out exactly what it is or whatever it is they're going to work out. But in the meantime, yeah, we're experiencing some significant volatility. There are definitely businesses that I am aware of in New Hampshire that have had in the plans either an expansion or some even Canadian companies that have facilities here in New Hampshire that have had plans for expansion that they've had to put on hold while they wait to see how this continues to work out. That is definitely not what we like to see. But I see at the same time, talking with some of our partners north of the border, it's an interesting dynamic. If you haven't had an opportunity to take a look and read about what the discussion has entailed in Canada in response to this, it's interesting. There is a lot of discussion around initiating their own type of relief program, like what we did during COVID with CARES Act or ARPA funds to assist their own businesses. But there's also a big movement to talk about the regulatory and production capabilities within Canada. And are those areas that they need to refocus on? There was an interesting survey that KPMG publicized just, I think, the week before, like last Friday, of Canadian businesses. And the thing that caught my eye was that 48% of businesses in Canada were considering whether or not they should explore opportunities in the United States to do their work and production in order to avoid the tariff penalty. So it's a little bit all over the map, and I don't mean to imply that there's one or the other that we would prefer, but I do think that that's an interesting piece of this discussion and one that speaks to the volatility that this has created on both sides of the border. And that, of course, as we saw early on in Jen's exercise, is not something is something that's actually really drilling down into the psyche of all of our business leaders in the state. As I mentioned, one of our major components and one of our major roles is to help with that issue where we can. We have an Office of International Commerce and a support team. Many of you may know Karen Immel, who is our regional business specialist for the Seacoast area. She is definitely moving around. She couldn't be here today, I don't think, because she's meeting with businesses on this subject. And then we have our Office of International Commerce. And one of the things that they're really looking at, not only just straight information that we gather that we can provide, but also What are some ways that businesses can start to look at diversifying supply chains? What are the ways businesses can find potentially other markets that are not within the tariff window at this point? At what pace do they want to go on that? I think is really subject to the needs of the individual business. But one of the areas that I am most concerned about when it comes to this tariff issue is the piece on energy. This is not something that has been really talked about, I guess, in the midst of expensive avocados before the Super Bowl and other consumer product impacts. But we are already, as a state, as I'm sure most of you who are business owners realize, not entirely competitive when it comes to the price of energy, whether that's heating or whether that's electricity. Any increase in the cost of electricity in New Hampshire only stands to make us less competitive, as we are starting to see a significant uptick, particularly in manufacturing and advanced manufacturing, as a result of workforce ability, and I think the growing sector in the life science space and bio manufacturing, all sorts of those types of industries. We have really begun to see a significant amount of activity, economic investment activity, and job creation. And if we are going to be dealing at the same time with increases again in our electrical costs, that could create a significant issue for the work that our department does in recruiting and helping those businesses expand. Of course, we continue to also deal with, as I think came up in the survey as well, is in the workforce and training piece. And I'm betting that there are at least one or two slides that Brian will have on that subject, because that continues to be a top line issue for businesses, I think, well before the tariffs came up and probably well beyond, is continuing to grow our capability as a state to make pieces go together. One of the things that's been a highlight over the last several years has been the partnership that we've really developed with the community college system and the university system. I think if any of you have been around for any period of time, you know that those entities and really the entities within those systems, so the individual community colleges and the individual universities around the state, have been heavily siloed and not always part of a broader economic strategy, particularly related to workforce and workforce training within the state. And that has been something that we have definitely seen happening. And I know, again, in terms of forecasting now, and hopefully independent of some of this immediate volatility, is that we're going to see continued growth on that. We've had great conversations with the new chancellor of the university system, Kathy Preventer. She's been in that system for a while. She knows how that works. And, there have been some significant partnerships. I'll point to one over in Keene that really is serving as a model that we would like to continue to see happen across the state, which is they've developed a training program for their precision optics industry, which is something that, for whatever reason, has a pretty significant little ecosystem over in the Cheshire Keene area. A lot of employers, companies like Corning and others, that develop these highly sophisticated systems for everything from binoculars to targeting systems for defense products. That is all located over in that part of the state, and they've developed a very specific program in partnership with those employers and Keene State College, and actually the local community college as well, to happen right there on the campus at Keene State. That's the kind of thing where we're able to make those pieces of the triangle go together. That's sort of a policymaker, employer, and academic institution institutionally working together to make those things happen. So those are all encouraging, and I think that those are the types of activities and programs that you'll see be a highlight of 2025. And of course, I'm not going to get through this conversation without talking about the ongoing crisis in housing. This is something that has been identified now for many years. We've had some focus, thankfully, at the state level on the issue of housing for the last probably 2 to 3 years, on a level where there's been actual financial investment in programs. Many of those have been administered by our department under our Invest NH program, where we, between 2022 and 2024, invested $100 million of federal ARPA relief funds into the housing crisis. And I think if I had to talk about what were some of the big takeaways from that experience, obviously the impact of inflation and increased costs and workforce shortages are impacting all of those projects, just like they are, everybody else in the economy. And that has sort of not helped in terms of our desire to have a speedy response to this crisis. But at the same time, we're still up against, a regulatory environment that is difficult to navigate for developers, whether they're nonprofit or for-profit, or whether they're trying to build a 200-unit project or whether they're trying to build a 5-unit project. This continues to be one of our biggest challenges. We've invested a good portion of those funds, and we are continuing under our new Housing Champions program to find opportunities to work with communities to help them understand if they can make the decision and affirm that there is a housing crisis in their community, and that the benefits that can come from trying to address that on the level that they feel is most appropriate for their community, what does that look like? And so we've launched a number of programs, as simple as an online toolbox, our housing community toolbox, right up to fully funded programs with our partners at New Hampshire Housing, called the Housing Opportunities Program, which is really an education effort and a grant program for communities to, raise their hand and say, we want to look at this. We want to understand how we would do it. What do we need to change? How do we need to improve, whether it's planning regulations or zoning regulations or whatever the case might be? How do we attract developers? All those types of questions. The encouraging thing that comes from that is that that program alone has attracted somewhere between 70 and 80 individual communities to that grant program. So to me, that's a pretty good affirmation of that there are communities out there that are willing to do that. We have now followed that up, as I mentioned, with our Housing Champions program. The Housing Champions program is basically a good housekeeping seal of approval kind of thing that the state legislature passed a few years ago, that gives communities that apply for and receive that designation access to, at this point, some state funds for infrastructure investment and for a general grant program to help either alleviate costs or to invest costs into the individual projects they may have in their community. So that program is underway. We've had 18 communities that have been designated in the first round, and that the process for them to apply for funding is open. I think we had 7 or 8 communities in the Seacoast region that received that, and I am anticipating several more will apply in our next round, which is I think later this spring. But those are where we're starting. I think there is going to be some additional interesting use of the Housing Champions program to connect to other types of incentives to assist communities in addressing the housing problem. So there are some bills in the legislature this year that are aimed at providing some additional resources, some of them for communities that are looking to make land available that they may have available to alleviate the cost of making that land available to a developer, have it be in areas that they feel where development would be most appropriate. And again, doing that sort of thing on their terms. There's also an interesting bill that was introduced by Senator Perkins Quokka in Portsmouth that would give access to a special low interest, I think it's a low interest loan part, some sort of program, beneficial program through the Business Finance Authority for businesses located within communities that are designated housing champions. Uh, that is another incentive, obviously, for municipalities to consider this. And then, really, the last thing, and I don't know that there's any legislation on this point, but particularly for our friends here at the meeting today that are in the banking industry, when we see these communities that have a housing champions designation, that is in effect a de-risking exercise for for lenders and for other investors, because they're going to be moving through a community that has effectively said, yeah, we want to be able to welcome affordable housing in our community, as opposed to a little bit of speaking of volatility, the volatility that comes when my example I've used for years of Farmer Brown's field, somebody just shows up, acquires that, shows up at a planning board meeting and says, I'm putting 75 units there. That doesn't always go over very well. And there are ways to avoid that. And communities that are part of our Housing Champions program would represent those types of communities that have already sort of been through that process and are willing to look at how they can accommodate affordable housing and thus the lenders that go with it. Two other things, and I think I'm probably running a little long, so I apologize. The I think last year when we talked, I did mention that we were beginning our process to expand the broadband access and high-speed internet across New Hampshire. Just very quickly, we have now reached almost a 60% threshold of that effort. So again, just to remind anybody who heard me talk about this last year, that's $90 million, again, of federal resources that are being invested to bring the entire state online and able to access high-speed internet. And that's got a definition, so it's really high speed. It's the broadband under broadband and fiber programs. We've put out, I think, a little over 1,000 miles of fiber so far this year through our two contractors. I know this is not a huge issue in the Seacoast area because you've had that capability for quite some time, but in other areas of the state, this has been a real challenge, particularly rural communities. Just imagine the future for a community that has no high-speed internet that sits next to a community that does. And as we continue to see growth and we continue to see that growth represent populations that use the internet very heavily, that creates a real economic disparity. So trying to tamp that down and make those types of that the broadband facilities available to everybody is a big issue. I'll jump to one last thing I wanted to mention. I didn't get to mention childcare, but I know that that's one other issue. I hope that we can start to talk about in the legislature this coming year. There's oddly not a ton of legislation on that subject this year. If there are opportunities to raise that from an economic standpoint and the impact that has on recruitment and retention, I certainly do that on a regular basis. But the last thing that's of interest that I thought I would mention, there was a study I read recently about obviously all the floods and the fires going on in the south and the western part of the United States. There's obviously a number of impacts that are coming from that, but one that is going to really have a significant and noteworthy impact is the cost of homeowners insurance, and how we're going to see costs not just in those areas, but nationwide. But the costs in those areas are going to be substantial, to the point where there are some predictions that insurance premiums might exceed mortgage payments in some of these areas. What is the result of that? The result is that it starts to create a dynamic where people are making decisions on where to live, not always based on economic resiliency, but based on climate resiliency. And the northern tier of the United States, despite, you have to like winter if you want to live in New Hampshire, but those are becoming part of the decision stream for people when they're thinking about where is their future location going to be. So, as I mentioned, we have definitely here in New Hampshire seen a reaction to our lifestyle and economic vibrancy in our demographic numbers. It's not like we're, unbelievable numbers of people coming here, but it is a noteworthy difference from what we have seen over the past decade or more, where we've seen increases in demographics, people moving to New Hampshire. I only expect, as a result of this early sort of model, is probably the best way to describe it, that may very well continue as we see changes in the climate in the southern parts and western parts of this country. And so, once again, it becomes important for us to pay attention to the housing issue, pay attention to the types of issues that we've talked about and that I've talked about as we look into the future, and to think about these things as, yes, challenges, but also reflective of a highly vibrant economy, and one that, we are in obviously a segment of volatility at this point. I hope that goes away over the next couple of 30 days or more. But if it doesn't, these continue to be these challenges that we need to focus on, because what we're dealing with and what create both challenges and opportunities in terms of workforce and revitalized communities and all those sorts of things are these types of other challenges. And given that type of interesting insight, I don't necessarily think that it's going to relent. So I think I will probably stop there, Jen. There's always so many things to talk about as it relates to the economy and where we're headed. And I know Brian always has some really fascinating insights as well. I don't want to rob anyone of that. So, Jen, thank you again for having me. I hope we can get next year back in person, where we can have that great breakfast from the students at the Tech Center. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I hope that as well. I know that we were on a call together, and you actually told everyone what great the breakfast was and how much fun you have coming to Exeter. I think you might have even said it's one of your favorite places to come to, which you might have said it or might not, but in my head, that's what I heard. So thank you for that. I'm going to turn it over to Brian. Brian, I know you have some slides. You should have the ability to share your screen right now.
I will do my best, Jennifer.
I believe in you.
Appreciate that vote of confidence.
Yep. While you're doing that, though, I think it's a good time to remind everyone, if they have questions, please use the chat, and we will monitor that and make sure that your questions are asked when our speakers are done.
Terrific. I hope everyone can see the first slide, the introduction. Am I accurate there?
Looks good. Looks good for me.
All right. Terrific. Well, I'll start out with a couple of caveats. One, this has been a really difficult year to do economic forecasts. There's a lot changing, particularly at the national level, that could have a pretty significant impact on the economic outlook. So there's a fair amount of uncertainty, and with any forecast, there's a lot of uncertainty. So I'm especially humble about this year's forecast. The other thing I wanted to mention is that if anybody wants to have a copy of this, Jennifer does have a copy, and you can just request it and she'll send it to you. And I guess lastly, one of the downsides for you folks to having this, there's many downsides in terms of having this virtually, is that based on a couple of the survey responses and things that the commissioner and others added, I added 2 slides, and I already have too many slides, so I'm going to zip through several of them. First, just in case I lose you along the way, very possible, here's kind of the overall outlook and the themes that I want to develop in this presentation. U.S. economy is performing well. Probability of recession is low. Even with all the uncertainty and some of the things that are happening at the national level, I still don't see any of those as a real strong threat to pushing the U.S. economy, New Hampshire economy into recession. The key to my outlook is really these things: low layoffs. They're near historical lows, both nationally and in New Hampshire. People's incomes are rising. Wages have been rising. It's problematic for a lot of businesses, particularly small businesses, but it's good for households. And solid consumer spending, as long as there aren't layoffs and incomes are rising. That spending is 70% of the U.S. economy, GDP, and that bodes well for at least continued economic growth in 2025. Some of the problems that we face, inflation is looking a little bit more stubborn, and interest rates, although they have eased just a little bit in the last week or so, they're a headwind to growth. We were counting on it, several months ago, inflation going down. It hasn't gone down to the way we had hoped. I think really importantly, the New Hampshire economy is beginning 2025 with really solid upward momentum. But I do think growth will be slower in the nation, in New Hampshire, but I expect New Hampshire will outperform the region. And for the first time in a few years, I'll say I think New Hampshire will outperform the nation. Big concerns, and you heard a little bit about this. Tariffs are my number one threat to the continued prosperity in 2025, but also reduced immigration has, the potential to exacerbate what is one of our critical issues, labor shortages. On balance, New Hampshire really benefits from immigration, very different than some southern states where our immigrants, on balance, tend to be more skilled and have higher levels of educational attainment. But those are things that will really influence, and we'll know more about them, I think, in the next 6 months. So again, what's kind of the key to my outlook? It's this chart, a little bit busy, 2 lines. The red line is what's happened to inflation going back to 2016. You see it spiked at just over 9% early in 2022 as the Russian invasion of the Ukraine occurred. Wage growth, the green line, has shot up following the pandemic, as businesses struggle to attract workers, offered higher wages. In the area that is shaded there is kind of the area and the time period where there was a lot of malaise among individuals in this country. Why? Because inflation was rising much faster than their wages, and that's a recipe for individuals feeling like their buying power has significantly been eroded, grocery prices high, et cetera, et cetera. But for almost 2 years, and actually it has been 2 years now, wages have been growing faster than inflation. So that's a recipe for continued positive consumer spending, and in fact, real consumer spending has gone up about 3%. Real inflation adjusted consumer spending year over year is up about 3%, which is really solid by historical standards. Issues that are a concern: what's going to happen with interest rates? I mentioned this is a 7-day moving average of the 10-year, the yield on 10-year government bonds. What you see is pretty significant increase since the pandemic. Has come down a little bit, but that's a reflection of financial markets' concerns about what will happen both with inflation, but also the nation's deficit. Those are two issues that potentially could be exacerbated. One, there is a concern that tax cuts could lead to higher deficits, which means the need for more borrowing, which would raise interest rates, and inflation, which could be exacerbated by tariffs, raising prices of imported goods. Those two things in combination could raise interest rates, keep inflation high, and that's a real concern. I know it was a concern expressed even in this survey at the beginning of this at this forum. Some of the good news is small businesses. This is a national survey done by National Federation of Independent Businesses. Small businesses have been relatively pessimistic over the last few years, and I understand why. I mean, the economy from an economist perspective has been pretty strong, but when you think about small businesses, they really suffer the most when prices rise, when wages rise, they're less able to absorb those costs. So materials costs were higher, wage costs were higher, and that's problematic for smaller businesses. Bigger businesses are much better able to accommodate those increases. Small businesses love Republican administrations, and that's reflected here because they're the largest increase in the Small Business Optimism Index in 40 years occurred in November, December. So that's positive, and it's positive for a number of reasons. Small businesses do a lot of the hiring in this country. So when they're more optimistic, that bodes generally better for hiring decisions. Big businesses do a lot of investment, small businesses do a lot of hiring. Looking at New Hampshire specific, there's been a survey that the Census Bureau has introduced in the last couple of years that asks businesses all across the country and can break it out by state, a number of questions about the performance of their business. And one of the key issues that I look at, one of the key questions is overall, how would you describe this business current performance? And they do this survey on a every 2 weeks, and I average it over a month. And what you can see here is that beginning about in the summer of 2024, you see that New Hampshire businesses have indicated that on balance, that their business's current performance on net has been improving. And I take the net of those who say excellent or above average, and I subtract those who say their business is below average or poor, and you get a net figure. And that's been on a pretty steady upward climb. So overall, I think optimism has increased, business performance has increased uh, pretty significantly in New Hampshire. One of the issues, and this was highlighted, I think, in the survey responses at the beginning of the forum, is what's happened with costs and inflation. And this is another question that the survey of New Hampshire businesses asked. How much has basically have the prices that you've paid and the prices that you charged increased, decreased, or remained the same? And this chart shows you the red line, which is the prices you have paid or your business has paid, was really during the summer, almost half of the businesses said that the prices that they paid were increasing. It has been steadily declining, and that's probably contributed a little bit to that upward swing in performance of businesses that you saw in the previous slide. But critical issue is they haven't raised their prices as many businesses haven't raised their prices as have seen their prices increase. And that's problematic, obviously, for profitability, may play into some of the concerns that we've had at the state level in terms of tax revenues, business tax revenues. But most recently, looking at the most recent months, more businesses have indicated that they have raised their prices. But still, this is problematic and gets to the concerns that businesses have about inflation or even wage increases. I mentioned that New Hampshire is beginning the year with solid momentum. This is a chart that shows year over year private sector job growth, and I average it over 3 months. 1 month, I don't like to get too concerned about 1 month's worth of data. New Hampshire is always the red line. Black line is the U.S., and I added the Seacoast. Seacoast here meaning two labor market areas, the Dover-Durham labor market area, which is really Stratford County, and the Portsmouth, Necta, New England City and Town area, which includes Portsmouth and Exeter and a number of surrounding towns. So the red line, New Hampshire, has been increasing again since approximately the summer. Had been trending down post-pandemic. We did a lot of hiring after the pandemic. It had been slowly, but still positive. But it has picked up, and it's picked up at a rate faster than New Hampshire or the U.S. overall. Seacoast has struggled a little bit more, although I wouldn't call that struggling. I think some of those issues related to the Seacoast have been with housing related and labor force related that have constrained the ability of the region to grow. Overall, New Hampshire, compared to all 50 states, this is a chart that shows the change in private sector employment compared to each state's pre-pandemic peak. And for New Hampshire, that pre-pandemic peak private sector employment was February of 2020. The striking aspect of this chart, I think, is how much better we have performed relative to our New England neighbors. And it's probably a little difficult to read all the names on those bars, but if you look, New Hampshire is by far, I think, the strongest recovery of any northeastern state, as well as just our New England neighbors. So we've done really well. The states on the far right are generally states that are didn't have the kind of shutdowns during the pandemic, the kind of efforts to control the pandemic that eastern states had. One of the keys to that performance that I just showed you is what's happened to new business formations in the state. And this is an index number because obviously New Hampshire and the US have vastly different numbers. So this represents a percentage change in the number of business formations. And I used the January, December 2020 as the base year. And you can see comparing New Hampshire, again, the red line, to the US, much greater new business formations. And I take a subset of those new business formations, and those are businesses that are most likely to hire employees. So not individual proprietorships. These are businesses like manufacturing or other businesses that are likely to hire. New businesses are responsible for about 40% of the job growth. So this bodes, again, well, and one of the reasons why we've seen that uptick in job growth in New Hampshire relative to the nation. One of the issues that we do face, red line again, New Hampshire, is what's happened to our labor force. The demand for labor is solid. It's slowed a little bit. But our labor force overall hasn't recovered as strongly as the U.S. U.S. now has a larger labor force than it did prior to the pandemic. I broke the Seacoast region out into two areas, Dover-Durham, which is again Stratford County, and Portsmouth, which has really been responsible for any of the growth in the combined Seacoast region. But this is the issue that we will face and confront going forward, is whether or not we can grow our labor force. And Commissioner Caswell talked a little bit about housing and migration. Those are really critical issues. Talking about demographics and why housing is so critical. This chart shows the three northern New England states, how they grow their populations. Population grows in three ways: natural increase, more people being born than dying; net domestic migration, more people moving into a state than moving out; and net international migration, more people moving in than from another country than moving out to another country. New Hampshire's had the largest population growth during this time period, 2010 to 2024, but our population has grown differently as well. When you look at Maine, big negative net population growth. New Hampshire now has net negative natural population growth, more people dying than being born, which means of course, we have to rely on people moving into the state if we want to continue to see our population and our labor force grow. That negative natural increase is not unusual. New Hampshire has well-educated women who participate in the labor force at high rates. That's a recipe for low birth rates. We have very low birth rates, like a lot of New England. They picked up a little bit in New Hampshire in the last year. But the thing that really stands out here to me, two things. International migration, critical. On balance, I have a whole presentation on this. On balance, international migrants have higher levels of educational attainment than our native-born population in New Hampshire. We still do. We do have refugees and individuals with lower skill levels, but on balance, we benefit. But the big difference that really strikes is how many more people have moved to Maine and net domestic migration. Does Maine have a stronger economy? No, I don't believe so. But I do think they have been more accommodating for movement into the state, and this chart just shows that. This is new private housing units authorized by building permit. And you just see over the last decade how many more housing permits have occurred in Maine than in New Hampshire. And I think until we address this, that in-migration, which had been strong immediately after the post-pandemic, has tailed off a little bit, largely, I believe, because we do not have the housing units to accommodate that growth. Quickly, I'm going to run through these. I mentioned immigrants. These are, if we restrict immigration, we restrict the size of the labor
Which I
force.
could see today because I wouldn't have been able.
The manufacturing employs about 10% of manufacturing workers are international migrants. And you just see here, I highlighted construction because I don't believe the accuracy that there's a more undocumented immigrants in the construction industry, and they're not captured in this data. Undocumented workers generally don't respond to surveys that ask them where they are, what industries they're working in. Gonna try to wrap up here my forecast. I do see rate of U.S. GDP growth slowing, 2.2%, so about at what we should be growing at. I included a little bit of what would happen if tariffs were implemented for the year. That's up in the air, but if the tariffs that have been talked about were implemented for the full year, I think growth would be a little bit below our full potential growth, 1.6%, but instead of 2.2, but not enough to put us into recession. Again, looking at CPI, I think it won't get down to that 2% level that the Fed would like, 2.6%, but with tariffs, I would see it going up to 3.1%. I do think overall retail sales will increase and be solid again because of wage growth. New Hampshire's job growth, I think, will be a little bit higher than the U.S., but both will be lower than they were in 2024. Compared to our neighbors in the U.S. overall, I think New Hampshire will be the standout. I don't do a lot of forecasting of other states, but I do have some formulas that allow me to take a shot at this. And my colleagues who are the other directors in New England states don't like to see this chart, but happy to show it to you folks. I did want to quickly touch on tariffs because they are the biggest risk. Here are our biggest trading partners, are the countries that supply the largest volume of imports into New Hampshire. And you see Canada is at the top, Germany, China, Mexico, three of those, Canada, China, Mexico, are on the front lines of tariffs, but I would expect that there'll be pushes to have tariffs on other countries as well. What comes into New Hampshire from Canada? Commissioner mentioned energy as a critical issue. Petroleum and coal products are the #1 import in 2023, but also aerospace products. There's a very vibrant aerospace industry in New Hampshire. There's a vibrant aerospace industry in the Quebec area, Montreal region, and we share a lot of products. Those would all be problematic. Our exports, Canada, Mexico, China, they will all reciprocate with tariffs should the U.S. go through with its tariff threats, and that will be problematic. Will make our products more costly. Our products will always also be more costly because if we import less, the value of the dollar will increase. Value of currencies, other currencies of other countries will decline. That will make our products more expensive. Plus, you add tariffs that it will mean we'll have less exports, and that's a recipe for a slower economic growth. So, think last chart. So, what on balance? We talked about the potential for tariffs, taxes, immigration, which are really the things at the national level that are likely to have a big impact on the economy. Well, tariffs. Generally, they raise the cost of goods, so that could increase inflation. They result in lower exports from our exporters. On balance, that means higher inflation, lower growth. Lower taxes increase potentially inflation. Why? Because of greater deficits. It will raise interest rates. GDP growth, however, will get a boost from that. Immigration will result in a smaller labor force, higher wage inflation, and again, with a smaller labor force, you wind up having fewer people working and GDP growth. So on balance, the policies that are being talked about are really mixed, and we won't really know for probably another 6 months how these will all play out, and that's one of the reasons why forecasting is so difficult this year. And with that, I will stop. I apologize. I know I took a lot of time there. I hope, Anna, I didn't offend you by taking too much of your time.
That was great, Brian. Thank you so much. And I should say that your slides will be available on the chamber website on the event. I will send the link shortly. And I like where you are right now with the dog and the sunset. It looks very different than the snow that just started falling.
I know that's my happy place. That is Old Silver Beach in Falmouth, Massachusetts.
We spend a lot of time in West Falmouth and at Bowerman's Beach and Chepacquet Beach, so lots of look for you there. Thank you for that. That's always really interesting and some great data to think about. A reminder for questions. If you have questions, I know one came in for the commissioner. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anna. And Anna, you should have the ability to share your slides as well.
Yes. And Brian, I was delighted you kept going because as a data nerd, I just eat stuff like that. So it was great. I'm looking forward to digging into those slides. And I was reminded multiple times that a lot of times the stories that you're hearing at the national level and the really hot political talking points don't necessarily tell the story about what's going on in New Hampshire and our unique, complex situation with our economy. So, and that's what I'm all about, because at Citizens Count, we're all about focusing on, what's happening at the state level, how you can get involved, and that often does have more of a day-to-day impact on your life. So I am going to go ahead and share a few slides. And my perspective here is coming in about mostly the legislature, but also a little bit of the executive. And because I am not an economist, I am not looking at that data for forecasts, but I can speak to the trends of how policymakers are looking at these issues and might be responding. So the first thing I'm going to jump in on is talking about the state budget, and a little bit of tea leaf reading here, because Governor Kelly Ayotte has talked some about what she wants to do, but she's not going to provide her address until next week. So in general, we know that it is a tougher state budget situation than we've been in previous years. So when we had all the federal COVID money coming in, that was not just money that was going out to our economy, it was also earning interest. Well, it was just sitting in the account. So all that interest is gone, as well as the funds. We've also seen slowing down revenue from business taxes. And then there's a few big lawsuits that are pending that could create big price tags for the state. So you've probably seen headlines about the Youth Services Center lawsuits related to juveniles getting physically and sexually abused. And no one really knows what the final price tag on that is going to be, because there are just so many lawsuits coming through. And then there is a school funding lawsuit. That is sort of an issue that has been going on for 30 years now. So it's not entirely new, but it is true that we're expecting some new rulings from the state Supreme Court, and there are a lot of legislators looking at this here. And our previous speakers talked a lot about potential impacts with tariffs. I will just throw out there was a brief federal funding freeze, and the Trump administration has indicated they are still interested in pulling back on some federal funding, but there's not a lot of guidance on these memos and how they might be implemented or what they might be looking like. But there is potentially, sort of cascading impacts if, for example, there's less federal funding for Medicaid. That would be a really big state budget ticket, how that costs and how those costs are broken down. And then also there are a lot of nonprofits in New Hampshire that have government contracts. And this is for social service, everything from after school programs to elder care to veteran services. So that also could have broader cascading risks, but it's just kind of a big question mark at this point what that might look like. So when I'm doing that little bit of tea leaf reading about what might get proposed, I think further state tax cuts are unlikely. Maybe some expanded tax credits. I think that there might be some appetite. Sorry, it is still a little early in the morning for that. So, for example, there's proposals I have seen to increase the R&D tax credit, increase contributions for scholarship funds, maybe the business tax credits that could be claimed related to Community Development Finance Authority contributions. So maybe there, but probably business tax rates will stay the same. And then I brought up the school funding. I am not sure that there will be any big changes this year, even though that conversation is happening. In general, I think that everyone right now it should be aware of longer term property tax implications related to that, because we're also seeing increased special education costs, health insurance costs for school employees, and those are often getting translated into higher local property tax rates. So it's definitely an issue that can vary a lot from town to town. But keeping an eye on that. And then I mentioned potential cascading effects related to healthcare, depending on what happens with federal funding. You know, if we see a complete overhaul of Medicaid expansion in New Hampshire, that could put a lot of pressure on our hospitals, who are also facing some headwinds on costs. So I'm going to blaze a trail of glory now through some hot issues that are in the legislative area. I'm not going to go too deep into individual bills for two reasons. One, limited time, but two, there are I think it was the final total is 1,057 bills, and a lot of those are going to get the axe before crossover day in early April. So a lot of times I think it's good to, if you're a small business owner, keep an eye on it and identify if there's something that's, you know, a hot red flashing light, like this is really critical for or against. But a lot of the other bills, it's okay to wait a little while and see what's going to make it through that first round in the House or the Senate. So healthcare, this is interesting because there is some interest related to different pockets of health insurance regulation. So for example, I've seen a whole flurry of bills that are looking to regulate and limit ambulance reimbursement and prohibit balance billing related to out-of-network ambulance rides. There's some interest in regulating pharmacy benefit managers. This gets really into the weeds. There's not really any sort of whole scale or really big flagship legislation I've noticed related to health insurance, but there are some bills like at the uncompensated care fund, which once again relates to hospitals and the funds that they receive for uncompensated care. So once again, just sort of flagging that issue as healthcare in New Hampshire, depending on what happens with the federal level, depending on what happens with this uncompensated care fund. That was sort of a not entirely resolved issue at the end of Sununu's last term. Could be some big conversations there about healthcare access in New Hampshire. Housing, oh my goodness, this is by far the biggest bucket of bills. There are dozens upon dozens. The big trend right now is bills that are pushing back on local zoning. So saying you can only have a minimum lot size so big, expanding the right to build accessory dwelling units as a right for homeowners, limiting parking space requirements, limiting how many occupants per bedroom a town can set. So the real thing is, in previous years, this have not gotten that far because there's a lot of concern about local control in New Hampshire. There's a long-standing tradition. However, this year it does seem to be there's more interest in this in previous years. When I'm looking at the number of sponsors, the bipartisan sponsors, more of the language around this, because it is not an issue that breaks down clearly on party lines. There are Republicans who are very much in favor of local control. There are Republicans who are very much in favor of opening up zoning and pushing back on restrictive zoning, saying that this is sort of like a right of property owners and freedom, and this is how we'll unleash the free market. And ditto on the Democrats. There are those that say we need to protect our local communities and have environmental impact concerns, and those that say, you know, this is an economic equality issue. We need to open up housing any way we can. So once again, with all of the dozens of bills, I think we'll have a better sense coming in late March about where's the needle going to move on this. There are some funding bills as well, but once again, in that tough budget environment I started with, I'm not expecting any major, huge infusions of cash for housing. Energy bills, there's a lot of interest in sort of small scale energy, microgrids, energy storage. If this is of interest to you, I would definitely encourage you to look at what Senator David Waters is doing, because he is from the Seacoast and he is a sponsor on a lot of these bills. So they're definitely looking to sort of innovate related to energy. And there's also interest in maybe expanding net metering when you're looking at group hosts, the size of net metering projects, and so on. And that's another issue where I think it's going to depend a little bit on how the rest of the year goes in terms of how much interest expands or decreases in those issues, because certainly as the price of electricity increases, as we noted, if tariffs are implemented and energy costs in New Hampshire are going up, maybe these will get pushed up a little more as higher priorities. But also in a budget year, sometimes complex legislation like this might be put off a little bit so they can spend more time on it over the summer and next year. So the other three issues I'm going to touch on: immigration. This is really mostly a federal issue, and there are bills at the state level that are touching on this issue, but they're mostly at the margins. The only one that I flagged that could have a significant impact on businesses was there's proposals to require businesses. One was all businesses, one was businesses over, I think, 25 employees, to use the E-Verify system to verify the immigration status of employees. And as of today, the recommendation on the bill coming up in the House, it was the committee unanimously voted against it because they said that this is a burden on employers. The system's not perfect. There could be false positives, real delays. So it's looking unlikely that that's going to go anywhere. And that was the only one at the state level that I think that has that big impact. Workforce, there are various proposals related to graduate retention programs. This touches a little bit on the question in the chat. Most of those, I would say, are focused on specific areas. So, for example, healthcare, or there's a lot of concern actually with state troopers, and I know that that's a priority for Governor Ayotte. So there's interest in that, but once again, we're in that tough funding environment. So sometimes even if legislators support an idea like this, it doesn't get off the ground because there's just higher priorities that need funding. And then last, to echo Commissioner Caswell, I was very surprised at the real dearth of childcare related legislation this year, because last session there was a whole special committee on childcare. There was a lot of interest, a lot of noise. There were proposals that, decreasing regulation or providing scholarships for childcare. It didn't get far, but like a business tax credit for businesses that provide childcare. And there's really almost no proposals this year. I pulled up my list last night again. I was like, yeah, that's just really not really anything to talk about. I will note, however, it's sort of related. There is a quote unquote Momnibus 2.0 that's getting introduced in the state Senate. And so that was the Momnibus is sort of a play on the word for omnibus. An omnibus bill includes a whole bunch of different policy proposals all together in one giant bill. So this Momnibus 2.0 is looking to add increased protections and access for young parents. So, for example, requiring employers to grant leave for, fertility-related treatments and prenatal, perinatal, postnatal appointments, and some other coverage for that. And that is, it's a whole long bill, but it's not directly child care. It's more related to parents and newborns and the mental health of new parents and so on. So my phone says 9:15. So I think I squeezed it right in, Jennifer. And I'm happy to pass it over.
Yeah, no, that was fantastic. I'm sure that there will be lots of questions for your slides as well. Would you mind emailing them to me, and then I can put them in our on the event website so everybody
I will do so now.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much. I know that there's a couple questions that came in. A reminder, please use the chat. I think there's a couple for Brian. There's a couple for the commissioner. Before I turn it over to have the commissioner answer that question, I just wanted to let everyone know I see my colleague John Nyan from the Hampton Chamber on the call today. Hi, John. Good to see you. John and I took part in a Zoom meeting with Senator Shaheen and her staff, who were very interested in wanting to hear what we're hearing from our members and local businesses about the impact on tariffs and anything else that's being discussed in Washington. So she was very gracious, and her staff would love to hear from you if you have any questions or want more information. She said that she would be interested in hearing that. So with that, Commissioner, do you want to take a crack at the question, I believe, up here? What's the New Hampshire doing to retain the younger generation to remain in the state after graduation from vocational or from college or university, stopping the brain drain?
Yeah, before I begin and I answer that, I just want to say I sit through a lot of legislative overviews on this on issues, and Anna, I thought you did an incredible job there. I mean that you got it all of the big things, not just because you agreed with me on childcare, but because those are the key issues, and she's absolutely got that down. Her information is consistent with what I am being told on the other side. So you got a good product right there. So thank you for your presentation, Anna.
Thank you.
I would say the biggest tool we have in our toolbox with regard to retention out of those systems is internships. And that is, a well-established way to have individual students get a little bit deeper into the New Hampshire economy and lifestyle, et cetera. And that goes across a number of different industries and education areas. That where we need to be better is, as I say, institutionalizing that effort, because there are plenty of ways, if you're a Dartmouth grad or a UNH grad, to call up somebody in an appropriate department and say, can we work something out for students to work in my company? That generally results in some good outcomes. But we need to have a much better institutional system where there is equal support, understanding, and ability to access those types of programs for businesses, both big and small. It gets challenging, admittedly, for smaller businesses. And we've looked at ways to try to use organizations like chambers and others to sort of stand in the middle and help manage the internship system itself for small businesses who just don't, sure, that would be a great tool. And I think it would be very appealing to a lot of those younger students in certain types of segments. But, unless there's somebody that can help them manage that, that's just really not an option for a lot. So there are policies and programs that we know of and that we are hopeful that we can continue to talk with the university system and community college system about, but it's just a matter of getting all those pieces together. But I would say internships is probably our best option there.
That's great. Thank you. Any of our other speakers want to touch on that before we move on to the next question?
I should also say Brian did a great job.
He did.
But he always does. So
it's like, okay. You got Brian in at the beginning when everyone was putting in what they think of with economic forecast. So I think his feelings are good.
That's right. That's right.
I think everybody has done a great job.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Jen.
Everybody wins. That's right. Everyone gets a trophy. Question for Anna. It now seems that in order to raise kids and make both ends meet in New Hampshire's economy, that both parents in the household need to have incomes. Would you agree? And what incentives is New Hampshire moving forward to help offset the pressures parents face?
I mean, that is an excellent question. And I would definitely also direct you to engage with the organization Stay Work Play, and there's other organizations in New Hampshire that are specifically trying to engage and lobby around the issues of young people and making this a good place for them to stay, work, and play and live and raise children. The question about, is it required to have two parents working to make both ends meet? I think that is a larger question that has been asked across the United States. And I think that it was a major shift over the past few decades. Without getting too high level philosophical, I would just say that it's not a challenge that is unique to New Hampshire. And I think that when we're looking at New Hampshire, probably the angle where most lawmakers are entering and talking about this is the housing issue still, because ultimately, if that is going to be 50% of a couple's take-home pay as a couple, that's their biggest ticket item. How else can we ease that process? So I think that that's usually the question when it comes down to about, making both ends meet. The childcare piece is, of course, a big part of that. And as we've said, I think that if that is a priority for business leaders here on the Seacoast or other areas of the state, that it'll just be important to start reaching out to legislators and telling your stories that what your employees are facing to once again bring that sort of higher up on the priority ladder again.